In the spring of 1887, in a quiet valley tucked beneath the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana, a man named Silas Brennan began doing something that struck his neighbors as plainly insane. He was cutting holes in the walls of his own cabin. Not windows, not vents. Narrow rectangular openings, each one no larger than a folded coat, set at carefully measured heights along the north, east, and south walls. Behind each opening on the inside of the cabin, he was building strange wooden boxes fitted with panes of thick glass. From the outside, the boxes looked like nothing at all, just neat little wooden doors that could be opened with a hinge. From the inside, they looked like display cases waiting for some unknown exhibit. People who passed the place on the road slowed their wagons. A few stopped entirely. Most rode on shaking their heads. Silas was 41 years old, a widower, soft-spoken, with hands that had spent more time turning the pages of books than swinging an axe. He had moved into the valley 3 winters earlier, bringing with him a wagon load of bound volumes, a set of tools no one could identify, and a quiet manner that gave away nothing. Now he was cutting holes in his walls before the spring planting was even finished. People noticed. People talked. By the second week, the purpose of the boxes became clear. Silas was filling them with bees. Not a hive in the yard, not a row of skeps behind the barn, but living colonies set directly into the walls of his home. The glass panes on the inside allowed him to watch the bees at work. The hinged doors on the outside allowed the bees to come and go as they pleased. By the end of the month, his cabin held 7 such colonies, each one humming faintly through the wood at all hours of the day. A man could stand inside that cabin in late April and hear a low, steady sound coming from every direction at once, like the building itself was breathing. The first person to confront him about it was Reverend Caleb Hatfield, who rode out one Saturday with 2 deacons in tow. The Reverend was a tall man with a steady voice and a deep conviction that the natural order of things had been settled long ago. He stood in Silas's yard and asked, plainly, what was being done here and for what purpose. Silas wiped his hands on his apron and answered without hesitation. The bees, he said, would heat the cabin through the winter. The Reverend did not laugh. He simply stared. Then he turned his horse and rode away without another word. That was the beginning. By midsummer, the story had reached every farm, every mill, every supply post within 30 miles. The valley was small. News traveled fast. Silas Brennan, the men said, believed bees could keep a man warm in January. Bees, tiny things that died in cold weather, tiny things that disappeared into their hives when the frost came and were not seen again until April. The whole notion struck the community as not merely wrong but somehow offensive, as though Silas were mocking the seriousness of winter itself. The blacksmith, a broad man named Orrin Page, said it most clearly one evening at the trading post. A man who trusts bees to keep him alive in a Montana winter, he said, deserves whatever the season decides to give him. The other men around the stove laughed. The phrase stuck. Within a week, it was being repeated as far down the valley as the railhead. Silas heard the talk. He did not respond. He continued tending his colonies, expanding his apiary, building a small shed behind the cabin that he called his reading room. The reading room held shelves of books, bound journals, agricultural reports, translated volumes from German, Russian, and Polish beekeepers, hand-copied notes from sources no one in the valley could name. Silas spent his evenings there, reading by lamplight, surrounded by paper, while the bees in his walls hummed on through the warm summer dusk. None of his neighbors knew it yet, but those books would not survive the year, and the winter that was coming would test something far older than any of them suspected. The talk about Silas Brennan grew louder as summer deepened, but inside the cabin itself, very little changed. A worn leather satchel still rested beside the bed where his late wife Annalise had left it 4 years earlier. Her sewing kit sat untouched on the corner shelf. A small framed daguerreotype of the two of them, taken on their wedding day in Pennsylvania, hung above the doorway where it had hung since the day Silas first nailed it to the log. He passed beneath it a dozen times a day and never seemed to notice. But on certain evenings, when the light slanted low through the western window and caught the glass at a particular angle, he would stop at the threshold for a long moment before stepping outside. Annalise had died of fever during their third winter in the territory. The cabin had been cold that year. Bitterly, brutally cold. Silas had burned through his entire woodpile by the second week of January, and still the chill had crept under every door, through every joint, into every breath she drew. He had watched her grow weaker as the cabin grew colder, and he had carried the memory of that helplessness into every season that followed. None of his neighbors knew this. He had never told them. He did not tell them now. What he had done instead in the years following her death was read. He wrote to seed merchants in Philadelphia. He corresponded with a German immigrant in Wisconsin who kept bees in a glass-walled shed. He ordered a translated edition of a Polish text on apiary architecture that arrived after 11 months in transit. He saved letters from a Russian Mennonite community in Kansas who had brought with them, across the ocean, the practice of building bee colonies directly into the south walls of their winter dwellings. The Mennonites had a saying for it passed down through 3 generations. The hive does not sleep. Give it shelter and it will give shelter back. At the time, those words had seemed beautiful but distant, the kind of phrase a man wrote in the margins of a notebook and rarely revisited. Standing now in his cabin, listening to the colonies hum through the walls, Silas understood that the Mennonites had not been writing poetry. They had been describing a fact. A honeybee colony in winter does not hibernate. It clusters. It vibrates. It generates heat through its own metabolism, holding the core of the hive at a steady temperature of nearly 95 degrees even when the world outside has fallen far below zero. A single colony, properly housed, produced immeasurable warmth. 7 colonies, set into the walls of a small cabin, would produce something else entirely. He had not arrived at this conclusion through guessing. He had arrived at it through years of patient reading, careful measurement, and the kind of slow, stubborn arithmetic that frontier men rarely had the leisure to perform. None of which mattered to the valley. None of which the valley would have listened to even if he had tried to explain. By the middle of July, a man named Jasper Wheeler began stopping by the cabin uninvited. Jasper was a small, wiry rancher who lived 2 miles east, and he held opinions on almost every subject with equal certainty. He stood in Silas's yard one afternoon, hands on his hips, studying the strange hinged doors set into the walls. "Those bees," he said, "will swarm out the first warm day in March and never come back. You'll be left with empty boxes and a cabin full of holes." Silas listened without interrupting. When Jasper finished, Silas simply nodded once and returned to his work. Jasper rode away annoyed. Annoyed men talked more, not less. The carpenter, a thoughtful older man named Wendell Brace, came by the following week. Wendell did not lecture. He walked slowly around the cabin, examining each hinged door, tapping the wood, running his palm along the seams where the box met the wall. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. "You've cut into your load-bearing logs," he said quietly. "In a hard wind, the north wall will be the first to fail." Silas considered this for a long moment before answering. "The bees," he said, "will know before the wood does." Wendell looked at him strangely. Then he climbed back onto his wagon and rode home without another word. August arrived hot and dry, and the valley settled into the slow rhythm of late summer. Wheat ripened in the lower fields. Cattle moved to higher pasture. The bitterroot stood pale and dusty in the afternoon haze. At the Brennan cabin, the 7 colonies had grown strong. The hum that issued from the walls had deepened. A man standing in the yard at midday could feel the vibration through the soles of his boots, faint as a heartbeat carried through wood. The bees themselves came and went in dark, twisting columns from each hinged door, departing toward the wildflowers of the meadow and returning heavy with pollen. It was in the second week of August that the incident occurred. A boy named Eli Hatfield, the Reverend's youngest son, was riding past the cabin on an errand for his mother. The boy was 9 years old and reckless in the way 9-year-old boys often are. He stopped at the property line to stare at the hinged doors, and then, on a dare from his own curiosity, He climbed the fence and approached the south wall to look closer. What happened next was never entirely clear. A sudden movement, perhaps, a shadow falling across an entrance, a bee striking his cheek. The boy panicked, swatted, ran. By the time he reached his pony, his face and arms had been stung in 9 places. He rode home screaming. The Reverend met him at the door. By that evening, Eli was swollen and feverish, but in no real danger. By the following morning, however, the story moving through the valley had changed shape entirely. A boy had been attacked by Brennan's bees. Set upon by the swarms that the strange man insisted on keeping in his walls. The fact that the boy had climbed a fence to provoke them was mentioned by almost no one. The fact that the stings had been delivered in self-defense, the way any colony defends its hive, mattered less than the symbol of the thing. A child of the church had been wounded. The cabin of holes had finally shown its true nature. Reverend Hatfield did not act in anger. He acted, as he always did, with deliberation. He rode to 4 neighbors over the course of 3 days. He spoke quietly to each one. He did not raise his voice or call for vengeance. He simply said, in his measured way, that a community has a duty to protect itself from notions that bring harm to its children. He suggested that the books Silas Brennan kept in his reading shed were the source of his strange convictions. He suggested that those books, written in foreign tongues by foreign men, had carried something into the valley that did not belong there. He left the conclusion unspoken. He did not need to speak it. They came on a Sunday afternoon, 6 of them on horseback. The Reverend rode at the front. Jasper Wheeler rode beside him. Orrin Page, the blacksmith, brought up the rear with a coil of rope slung over his saddle that he did not, in the end, have any use for. Silas was in the meadow when they arrived. He walked back to the yard slowly, his hands stained with the dark wax of a hive he had been inspecting. He did not speak. He did not need to. The Reverend explained calmly and at length that the books would be removed, that they would be burned, that this was being done not in cruelty but in care, both for the community and for Silas himself, who had been led astray by ideas no Christian man should entertain. Silas listened. When the Reverend finished, Silas walked to the reading shed, opened the door, and stepped aside. He did not argue, he did not plead. The men carried the books out armload by armload and stacked them in the bare patch of yard between the cabin and the well. There were 42 volumes in all, the German texts, the translated Polish manuscript, the letters from Kansas. The handwritten notebooks Silas had filled over 4 winters. They burned for nearly 2 hours. Silas stood at the edge of the yard and watched without moving. The bees in the walls of the cabin hummed on, undisturbed, as the smoke rose into the August sky. The men rode away when the last of the books had burned down to ash. The Reverend paused at the gate and offered to speak a prayer over the property before he left. Silas thanked him with a brief nod and declined. The Reverend studied him for a moment longer, then turned his horse and followed the others down the road. The yard grew quiet. The fire smoldered. A soft wind moved through the meadow grass, and somewhere in the south wall, a colony adjusted itself with a low collective sigh of wings. Silas did not move for a long time. When he finally stepped forward, he did not approach the fire. He walked instead to the well, drew up a bucket of cold water, and washed the wax from his hands. He washed them slowly and thoroughly, the way a man washes after closing the eyes of someone he loved. Then he carried the empty bucket back into the cabin and set it beside the door. The hum of the bees met him as he crossed the threshold. He stood in the dim room for several minutes, listening, his back against the inside of the wall where the largest colony had built its comb. The wood was warm to the touch. What no one in the valley knew, what no one would have believed if he had tried to tell them, was that the most important volumes in his collection had never been kept in the reading shed at all. Silas had spent 4 winters copying the essential calculations into a single small leather notebook that he kept inside an oilcloth wrap, buried in a tin box beneath the floorboards under his bed. The tin held the heat tables from the German sources, the hive spacing diagrams from the Polish manuscript, the Kansas letters describing winter cluster behavior in unheated bee houses, the translations he had paid for in coin and patience over the course of years. 42 books had burned in his yard. The substance of those books, the part that mattered, had not been in them for a long time. He did not tell the valley this. He did not tell anyone. He simply went back to work. The work changed in subtle ways after that afternoon. Silas began rising earlier. He moved with greater quietness around the property. He stopped going to the trading post for supplies and instead made the longer ride to a settlement on the far side of the ridge, where his face was not yet known. He continued tending his colonies, but he no longer worked on them when wagons were passing on the road. The hinged doors on the outside of the cabin began to seem less like exhibits and more like something he wished to keep from common view. Inside the cabin, however, the preparation deepened. He began wrapping the inner walls in layers of heavy felted wool, leaving generous spaces between each layer and the glass-faced colony boxes. The wool would trap the heat the bees generated, holding it close against the logs rather than allowing it to dissipate through the room. He fitted small, adjustable vents above each hive, so that excess moisture could escape without carrying away warmth. He built a low wooden bench along the inside of the south wall, where a person could sit and feel the heat of 3 colonies at once through the polished glass. The bench became his evening chair. He took his supper there now, alone, listening to the steady purr of the wings. A neighbor's daughter, a girl of 11 named Hattie Lowell, began stopping by the cabin once or twice a week on her way home from school. She was a serious, thin-faced child, and her parents did not know she came. She would stand at the fence and watch the bees enter and leave the hinged doors. Sometimes Silas would notice her there and lift his hand in a small acknowledgement. She never came inside. She never asked questions. But on one of these afternoons in late August, she finally spoke across the fence in a voice barely louder than the bees themselves. "My grandmother kept hives in Pennsylvania," she said. She said they were warm in winter. Silas paused in his work and looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he answered softly. "Yes," he said, "they are." September arrived with the first hint of cold in the morning air, and the entire valley began the long, quiet shift toward winter. Cattle were brought down from the high pastures. Hayricks rose in the meadows. Chimneys that had stood unused since May began to send up their first thin streams of smoke at dawn. At the Brennan cabin, the 7 colonies entered the season of their greatest activity. The bees worked through every daylight hour now, filling the upper combs with the last heavy stores of honey, sealing cracks with propolis, narrowing the entrances of their hinged doors with their own dark resin. The hum from the walls had grown deeper, slower, and more deliberate, the sound of a household preparing for a long indoor confinement. Silas began keeping a record. He hung a thermometer on the south wall of the cabin, away from the stove and the colony boxes, where it could measure the air of the room itself without bias. Beside it, he placed a small leather notebook with ruled pages. Every morning at sunrise and every evening before sleep, he made an entry: outside temperature, inside temperature, wood burned, be activity at each of the 7 hinged doors. The cluster sounds from each colony, which he had learned to distinguish by ear, the way another man might recognize the voices of his children. The entries were short. The columns of figures grew long. Jasper Wheeler stopped by one cold morning to deliver a sack of milled corn, an arrangement that had been agreed upon months earlier and that Jasper now seemed to regret. He saw the open notebook on the table and snorted. "You're going to write your way through winter," he said. "The cold doesn't read." Silas paid him for the corn without responding. Jasper rode away shaking his head. The figures continued to accumulate. By the end of September, Silas had 2 full pages of paired numbers, and a pattern had begun to emerge inside them. On a morning when the outside temperature stood at 38 degrees, the cabin held at 56 without the stove lit since the previous evening. On another morning, after a sharp overnight drop to 29, the cabin still held at 51. The numbers were quiet. They were also exact. October brought the first hard frost, and with it came an old man named Tobias Wren. Tobias lived alone in a small cabin at the far end of the valley and was generally regarded as the closest thing the community had to a weatherman. He was 73 years old, lean as a fence rail, with eyes that had spent 6 decades reading sky and bird and bone. He did not attend church. He did not visit the trading post. He kept his own counsel in matters of weather, and when he spoke, men who had laughed at Silas's bees listened without smiling. Tobias rode up to the Brennan property on a still gray afternoon and dismounted without a greeting. He walked once slowly around the cabin. He stopped at each hinged door. He bent low to one of them and held his ear close to the wood for a full minute, then straightened and moved to the next. Silas watched from the doorway without speaking. When Tobias had completed his circle, he came to the porch and looked the younger man directly in the eye. "The geese went south 3 weeks early," he said. "The squirrels have packed their drays twice over. There's ice on the North Creek that shouldn't be there until November." He paused. "This winter is going to come down on this valley like nothing any of us have seen." Silas nodded once. He had already known. The bees themselves had told him in the slow narrowing of their entrances, in the heavy stores they had laid up faster than any normal year, in the deepening note of their cluster hum. Tobias studied the south wall for another long moment. Then he asked, in a voice neither friendly nor hostile, how many colonies. "7," Silas said. Tobias considered this. He looked at the cabin again, at the way the felted wool could be seen through the doorway behind Silas, at the small chimney with its thin, patient stream of smoke. He said nothing more. He climbed back onto his horse and rode away. But unlike every man who had ridden away from that cabin before him, Tobias Wren did not laugh as he went. November came down on the Bitterroot Valley with a heaviness that everyone could feel. The sky went pale and stayed pale. The wind shifted to the north and would not shift back. Wells crusted over by dawn each morning. The cattle in the lower pastures stood with their tails to the cold and would not move for hours at a time. Tobias Wren was seen riding the back roads more frequently than anyone could remember, stopping at homesteads to check chinking, to test door frames, to ask after the size of wood piles. Where Tobias paused longest, the families took notice. Where he rode past without slowing, they took notice of that as well. At the Brennan cabin, the final preparations took on a careful, almost ceremonial quality. Silas closed 2 of the 7 hinged doors entirely, the ones on the north wall that faced the direction of the coming storms, sealing the colonies inside with smaller modified entrances that opened only on the cabin's interior. The bees that had used those outer doors all summer would spend the winter venting their activity into the living room itself, contributing the full measure of their warmth to the space he intended to inhabit. He banked earth against the lowest course of logs all the way around the cabin, packed it firm, and laid pine boughs over it. He brought in 3 months of split wood and stacked it along the inside of the east wall, both as a fuel reserve and as additional insulation. He filled the cabin with the small, dense industry of a man who had been planning this for years. Word of the closed doors reached the trading post within a week. Orrin Page, the blacksmith, laughed loudly enough to be heard from outside the building. "He sealed his bees in with himself," the blacksmith said. "The man's going to spend the winter inside a beehive." The remark drew the laughter Orrin had hoped for. A new nickname spread through the valley before nightfall. Silas Brennan no longer lived in a cabin. He lived in the hive. The phrase reached his ears from Hattie Lowell, who delivered it to him across the fence one cold afternoon with an embarrassed face. Silas only smiled at her, the first real smile she had seen from him in months. "Tell them," he said quietly, "that a hive is a warm place." The girl looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded and walked home. Elsewhere in the valley, the preparation was less complete. The Wheeler homestead had a fine new roof but old chinking that had not been repacked in 3 seasons. The Page house had a magnificent stone chimney and a wood reserve barely large enough for 6 weeks. Reverend Hatfield's parsonage held generous fireplaces but drafty window frames that whistled on the mildest breeze. None of these things mattered in an ordinary winter. The valley had ordinary winters most years. The men who had built these houses had built for ordinary winters, and the building had been good enough. Ordinary winters, however, were not what was coming. The first heavy snow arrived on the night of November 28th, and by the following morning the valley lay under 14 inches. People were not alarmed. November snows happened. The wind stayed moderate. The temperature, while cold, stayed in a range that any homestead could manage. The work of feeding livestock and clearing paths absorbed everyone's attention. Smoke rose steady from every chimney in the basin. Children went sledding on the slope below the church. For 3 days the valley looked like a postcard of itself, white and orderly and quiet under a pale winter sun. Then, on the evening of December 2nd, Tobias Wren rode through the settlement at a pace that was not quite a gallop but close to it. He stopped at 5 houses. He did not dismount at any of them. He spoke briefly to each family in turn and rode on. The message he delivered was the same at every door. Bring the livestock clothes. Bring in every stick of wood you can carry. Sleep in your clothes tonight. He did not stop at the Brennan cabin. He looked toward it as he passed and saw the thin, patient column of smoke rising from the chimney, and he kept riding. By midnight the wind had begun to rise. By dawn it was screaming. The blizzard had come. December 3rd broke without a sunrise. The dawn that should have come simply did not arrive. What appeared in its place was a churning gray darkness that pressed against every window in the valley and refused to lift. The wind came down from the high pass above the Bitterroots in long, roaring sheets, and the snow came with it, driven horizontally across the open country at speeds that made the falling of it almost incidental. Within an hour the temperature had dropped 34 degrees. By mid-morning, gusts were being measured later at 62 miles per hour. By noon the strongest of them had pushed past 75. The valley vanished. Fences disappeared first, swallowed beneath drifts that built and rebuilt themselves with each passing gust. Barns standing only 50 yards from kitchen windows became invisible. The church steeple, the tallest structure in the basin, could not be seen from any of the houses around it. A man stepping outside his door could not see his own boots. The wind carried away the sound of his shouts before they reached the ear of anyone beside him. Cattle in the open pastures, where ranchers had failed to bring them in clothes, turned their backs to the storm and stood unmoving as the snow built against their flanks. Some of them would still be standing in those positions when the storm finally ended, though they would no longer be alive. At the Wheeler homestead, Jasper discovered within the first 3 hours that his old chinking was failing in 9 places at once. Wind drove through gaps he had not known existed. Snow began to accumulate on the inside of his north wall, in fine powdery lines that grew steadily through the day. His wife stuffed rags into the cracks. The rags froze in place. The wind found new gaps and drove through those instead. Jasper kept the stove blazing and watched his woodpile shrink at a rate he had not planned for. By evening, the thermometer in his front room read 38 degrees despite the fire roaring 3 feet away. By the second day, it would read 31. At the Page house, the magnificent stone chimney drew so well that it pulled the heat of the stove straight up and out into the storm. Orrin burned wood twice as fast as he had estimated. His children slept in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. The blacksmith made no jokes that night. He sat in his rocking chair with a rifle across his knees, not for any particular threat, but because a man needs to hold something solid when his house is moaning around him in a wind he has never heard the equal of. At the parsonage, Reverend Hatfield read the book of Job aloud to his wife and 3 children by the light of a single lamp. He read it slowly. He read it with feeling. He read it because reading was the only thing he could do that gave his family the impression of a man in command of his household. The windows whistled. The doors shuddered against their hinges. Eli, the boy who had been stung in August, sat closest to the stove and pulled a quilt over his head and did not look out at the storm. 2 miles down the road from the parsonage, the Brennan cabin stood almost invisible beneath an accumulated cap of snow. The drift on the north side rose halfway to the eaves. The hinged doors on the outer walls had long since vanished beneath the white. From the road, only the chimney could be seen, and only intermittently when the wind paused for breath, and from the chimney rose the same thin, patient column of smoke that had been rising from it since November. The smoke did not thicken. It did not desperately surge. It rose in the same modest, steady plume it had risen in for weeks. Inside the cabin, Silas sat on the wooden bench along the south wall. The thermometer above the bench read 63 degrees. The stove burned at a low, even pace, requiring no more than 2 small logs every 4 hours. The 7 colonies hummed in the walls around him, their deep collective sound filling the space the way a held chord fills a room. He had his notebook open on his knees. He was writing, by lamplight, the entries for the 3rd of December, his hand entirely steady. The blizzard did not let up through the night of December 3rd. It did not let up through the day of the 4th. The wind held above 60 miles an hour for nearly 40 consecutive hours, an event that would later be described in territorial weather records as the worst 3-day storm in the region's recorded history. Snow accumulated to depths that no one could measure while the storm continued, because no one could stand outside long enough to measure anything. Inside every cabin in the valley, families simply listened to the roaring and waited for it to end and conserved what warmth they could. Inside the Brennan cabin, something else was happening, something that would not be fully understood by anyone in the valley for years to come. The 7 colonies in the walls were not asleep. They had never been asleep. A honeybee colony in winter forms itself into a tight spherical cluster around its queen, and the bees of that cluster vibrate their flight muscles continuously without moving their wings. The motion produces no flight. It produces heat. Each individual bee generates only a tiny amount of warmth. A colony of 40,000 bees, generating warmth together, holds the center of its cluster at a temperature near 95 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of the conditions outside. 7 such colonies, set into the inner walls of a small insulated cabin, with their hinged outer doors sealed against the storm and their inner faces open to the room, produced a quiet continuous warmth that the storm could not reach and could not steal. The bees themselves did not know that they were heating a cabin. They were heating themselves, as they always did. But the architecture Silas had built around them made the heat they produced for their own survival into something more. The wool-lined inner walls held it. The hinged outer doors, now sealed and packed with felt, prevented it from escaping outward. The narrow vents above each colony allowed only moisture out, never warmth. The cabin had become, in effect, an enormous extension of the colonies themselves. The bees treated the whole structure as part of their cluster. Silas, sitting on his bench beneath the thermometer, was simply another body inside the hive. He understood this. He had calculated it. He had read about it in the books that had been burned in his yard 4 months earlier, and copied the essential figures into the small notebook in the tin box beneath his floorboards. He knew that his cabin would not freeze. He knew it the way another man knows the sun will rise. The storm outside was the loudest thing he had ever heard in his life, but he did not check the walls. He did not pace. He did not worry. He read for a while. He fed the stove its modest portion of wood. He watched the bees through the polished glass of the colony boxes, where they could be seen as a dense living mass packed into their winter cluster, vibrating, breathing, generating the steady warmth that surrounded him. 2.5 miles to the east, the Wheeler family had moved the entire household into a single small room and were burning their kitchen chairs in the stove. Jasper had broken up the chairs with an axe in the middle of the second night, when his woodpile reached a level that frightened him into action. His wife had wept silently while he did it. The children had watched without understanding. The thermometer in the room held at 29 degrees by the morning of the 4th. At the parsonage, Reverend Hatfield's wife developed a deep cough on the second night and could not stop coughing by morning. The Reverend wrapped her in every blanket they owned and laid her on a pallet directly in front of the stove. He prayed over her continuously through the day. The cough did not ease. The fire roared. The cabin held at 33 degrees. At the Page house, Orrin broke down a wooden cradle that had not been used in 8 years and burned it for fuel. His wife did not speak to him for the rest of the storm. At the Brennan cabin, the thermometer above the bench held at 61 degrees. Silas wrote the entry for the evening of December 4th. His hand was still steady. The storm released its hold on the Bitterroot Valley sometime in the gray pre-dawn hours of December 5th. The wind dropped from a roar to a moan, and then from a moan to the ordinary breath of a cold winter morning. By the time the first thin daylight crept across the eastern ridge, the basin lay silent under a depth of snow that would not fully melt until the following May. Drifts had buried fences entirely. Several roofs in the lower settlement had collapsed beneath the accumulated weight. 3 cattle had frozen standing upright in the Wheeler pasture. 2 had survived only because Jasper had finally broken down the door of his root cellar and forced them inside on the second night. The valley took most of the day to dig itself out. Doors had to be excavated. Paths had to be cut. Smoke began to rise from chimneys that had nearly gone out. Word spread from house to house slowly, carried by men on snowshoes. No one in the immediate settlement had died, though the Reverend's wife was gravely ill and would remain in her sickbed for the better part of 3 weeks. 2 homesteaders in the far end of the valley had not been heard from, and parties would set out the following day to check on them. The cost of the storm, when it was finally calculated, would be the worst the basin had ever paid. Cattle lost, roofs gone, wood reserves exhausted 3 months before the winter would actually end. Orrin Page was the first man to walk to the Brennan cabin. He did so on the afternoon of December 5th, without saying anything to his wife about where he was going. He came on snowshoes, taking nearly 2 hours to cover what was normally a 40-minute walk. He expected to find the cabin destroyed. He expected to find drifts piled to the eaves and no smoke from the chimney, and the strange experiment of Silas Brennan finally answered with a silence the valley would talk about for years. What he found instead, when he came around the last bend in the road, was a thin, patient column of smoke rising from a chimney exactly as it had risen for weeks. The cabin itself was almost buried, but smoke means warmth, and warmth means life, and Orrin stopped in the snow and stood for a long time staring at that smoke before he could bring himself to move forward. When he reached the door and knocked, Silas opened it without surprise, as though he had been expecting visitors at some point and was unconcerned which one came first. Warm air rolled out into the yard. Orrin felt it on his face before he had even stepped inside. He came into the cabin and stood blinking in the dim warmth, and he understood within 5 seconds that he was standing inside a room that was warmer than any room he had been in for 3 days. The thermometer above the bench read 62. The stove was burning at a low, even pace. The colonies hummed in the walls, the same deep collective sound they had been making since August. Silas's notebook lay open on the table. Orrin walked to it without asking permission and began turning the pages. He read the columns of paired numbers. He read the outside temperature for each day of the storm. He read the inside temperature beside it. The numbers did not require interpretation. They simply existed. The cabin had held above 60 degrees for the entire 72 hours of the worst blizzard ever recorded in the Bitterroot Valley, on a wood consumption rate that worked out to less than 1/4 what Orrin himself had burned in the same period. The blacksmith closed the notebook carefully. He set it back on the table where he had found it. He looked at Silas, and Silas looked back at him, and neither man spoke for a long while. Then Orrin walked to the south wall and placed his palm flat against one of the polished glass colony boxes. He felt the warmth of 40,000 bodies vibrating in their winter cluster, holding their queen alive, holding the man in front of him alive, holding the entire cabin alive. He lowered his hand. He said, simply, "I was wrong." Silas only nodded. Spring returned to the Bitterroot Valley the way it always did, slowly and without ceremony. The drifts retreated from the lower roads first. The creeks broke free in the second week of March. By April, the meadows were showing green at their edges, and by May the wildflowers had begun to lift their heads along the south-facing slopes. The 7 colonies in the walls of the Brennan cabin came out of their winter cluster lean and ravenous, and within days the hinged doors on the outer walls were once again sending up their dark, twisting columns of bees into the warming air. Orrin Page came back to the cabin in the second week of April. He did not come empty-handed. He brought with him a pair of hinged wooden frames he had fashioned in his own shop over the long, convalescent weeks of February, copied roughly from what he had seen in Silas's south wall. He asked the older man, with a humility that did not come naturally to him, whether Silas might be willing to show him how the colony boxes ought properly to be built. Silas took the frames in his hands and examined them carefully. He pointed out 3 things that would need to be changed. Then he invited Orrin inside, and the 2 men spent the entire afternoon at the kitchen table drawing diagrams on a sheet of butcher paper. Reverend Hatfield came in May. He came alone, on foot, and he stood at the gate for nearly 20 minutes before he opened it. When he finally crossed the yard, he removed his hat and held it in both hands, and he said what he had come to say without preamble. He had been wrong about the books. He had been wrong to burn them. He had acted in fear and called it care, and a man in his position should know the difference. He did not ask for forgiveness. He offered instead to help replace what had been destroyed. He had written to a publisher in St. Louis. He had reached out to a German Lutheran congregation in Wisconsin who he believed could obtain certain volumes. He intended, he said, to spend whatever portion of the rest of his life was required to restore the library he had burned. Silas listened to all of this in silence. When the Reverend finished, Silas considered him for a long moment. Then he said quietly that some of the books could not be replaced, but that the offer itself meant a great deal. He invited the Reverend inside for coffee. The Reverend accepted. By the following winter, 3 other cabins in the valley had bee colonies built into their walls. By the winter after that, there were 11. Hattie Lowell, who had grown into a serious young woman of 13, took it upon herself to learn the practice in full. She apprenticed with Silas through 2 summers and went on, in her later life, to keep colonies in the walls of her own home, and to teach the method to her daughters. Tobias Wren lived to see the practice spread to nearly 40 homesteads across the basin before he finally died peacefully at the age of 81. He left his small library of weather records to Silas Brennan in his will. The 42 volumes that had burned in the yard were never fully recovered. Some titles were replaced, some were not. The leather notebook in the tin box beneath the floorboards was eventually transcribed into a clean-bound edition that Silas distributed at no cost to anyone in the valley who asked for one. He lived in the cabin for another 26 years. The hum of the bees never left its walls. The story passed into the kind of legend that takes a long time to settle into truth. People who had not been alive during the blizzard of 1887 grew up hearing about the cabin that had outlasted the storm, the man who had been mocked and burned out and proven right by a winter so cruel it became a measuring stick for every winter that came after. The lesson, when it was finally distilled, was the kind of lesson that always seems obvious in hindsight and never seems obvious in advance. Warmth does not always come from fire. Wisdom does not always come from the loudest voices. And sometimes the strongest house in a valley is the one that has been listening, very quietly, to something the rest of the valley cannot yet hear.